Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining us for yet another session being organized around the impact of small-scale fisheries around the world, or the role of small-scale fisheries around the world by Too Big to Ignore. My name is Niaz Duri. I'm the coordinating director for the Northwest Atlantic Marine Alliance here in the United States, in the Northeast United States, here in Gloucester, Massachusetts. Thank you to Too Big to Ignore for organizing this. My co-moderator for today is Tuna, who some of you have probably already viewed on many of these videos. And she will be moderating the chat and sending any of your questions our way. I know it's early in a lot of places, so we may have a slow build to our audience. But I wanted to start by introducing the panelists who are with me today and giving them a chance to say a little bit more about their background and their own stories. We have Gayatri from Sri Lanka, who is a senior researcher at Center for Poverty Analysis and leads the Livelihood and Employment Research Cluster. Gayatri, you want to wave so we know? There we go. Thank you. We have Vatsu from Madagascar, who is actually currently, I think, the United Nations Nippon Foundation Fellowship is serving in that capacity right now. And she'll tell us a little bit more about herself as well. She's part of the Bihari Network, which is a network of locally managed marine areas in Madagascar. We have Jason Jarvis from Rhode Island here in the US, who is a commercial fisherman as well as NAMA's board president. We have Courtney from Nova Scotia. She is an Ocean Frontier Institute postdoctoral fellow at the Grenfell Campus Environmental Policy Institute at the Memorial University of Newfoundland. She's actually in Nova Scotia at the moment. And finally, we have Martin, who is in South Africa, and he is the managing director of International Pole and Line Foundation, a global charity whose vision is a world with thriving fisheries that works in balance with nature by catching fish, one fish at a time. So that's who we have with us. Thank you, everybody, for joining me at the various time zones that you're all in. For those who are joining us, the title of this is to really talk about whether or not there is a reality or a dream when it comes to access to resources by small-scale fisheries around the world. So our speakers are going to speak to their experience about access and to various resources, including markets and infrastructure, as well as policy issues to the extent that they can. But I want to first start by having everybody introduce themselves in their own words. So we'll start with get my paper with Gayatri in Sri Lanka. If you don't mind telling us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll go from there.
Thank you, Niaz, and thank you for having me on this panel. So, as Niaz already introduced, I'm based in Sri Lanka, and I've also, so most of my work had been focused on Sri Lanka, and recently I've also been doing some work focusing on Cambodia as well. So in my discussion and whatever points that I bring out, I'll be mainly drawing from these two cases. So my work on small-scale fisheries over the last 10, 15 years had drawn mainly on the diversity of the small-scale fishes. So while we do understand, we acknowledge, and we also advocate for small-scale fishers as one cohesive group, what I've also found out, and what I'm also quite passionate talking about, is the internal intra-group differences within this cohesive group of small-scale fishes. And to give a specific example of some of the work I've been doing, both academic and policy oriented over the last few years. I've been doing quite a lot of work focusing on the women gleaners in Sri Lanka on the east coast of the country. And the east coast of the country had also been directly affected by the 30-year-old war that Sri Lanka suffered. So when I talk about these intergroup differences, what I mean is that, some of these groups are not even, considered in terms of policy, strategy, practical action at the national level, the regional level, or even at the household level sometimes. So I've been using this feminist framework, theoretical framework called intersectionality to some of my work. So that is a little bit of background about my work, but also what I would like to bring to the table today.
Thank you so much for telling us a little bit more about yourself and your work. We will now go to Madagascar with Vatsu.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. So my name is Vatsu, and I'm from Madagascar. I'm currently coordinating the Mihai network, which is the network of all coastal communities involved in the management of locally managed marine areas. So we have lots of small-scale fishers inside that network. And that network was created actually to kind of represent the voices of those isolated small-scale fishers in Madagascar, to make sure, because they are located in remote areas and it's difficult for them to be heard. So that is why Mihai was created, and my role is actually I'm working a lot on advocacy for the rights of those small-scale fishers in Madagascar in terms of legal framework, in terms of rights in general, and also we build their capacity in management, in leadership, in how to manage an association, how to do public speaking. So they have the ability, the capacity to really interact with high-level stakeholders. And we also organize lots of events. We call them Fishers Forums, so where we cover lots of stakeholders from the government, from NGOs, from private sectors, to talk about like access to market, and also representatives from the communities. So in those forums, we come up with some kind of letter of intent from the government, or some kind of trying to make sure that the community, the small-scale fishers, are integrated into all decision makings on policy that needs to be elaborated for the country. So that is what we do in general, and maybe just something I wanted to share is one of our biggest work in 2017. We presented to the government a kind of a motion where the communities requested a kind of an exclusive fishing zone to have secured resources. So we are now at the moment still working on that project. And also we are now in the process to work on the elaboration of a kind of legal framework that recognizes the rights of those locally managed marine area communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Vatsu. Now we'll go to Rhode Island here in the United States with Jason.
Hey, good morning. Jason Jarvis out of Westerly, Rhode Island. I operate a small 25-foot vessel, rod and reel, fish pots, also rigging for shellfish, and been at it about 8 years doing that. Prior to that, I was in, industrial, I guess, fisheries rather than artisanal fisheries for about 20 years. I've been pushing for the small scale fisheries to be noticed for about 8 years here. Most of our fish is exported, so trying to find local fish in my own little town has not been possible for a long time. And because of us fighting for it, it's now starting to change. And I think that the push for getting local seafood by consumers is a lot better now than it was. Most people want to know where their food's coming from these days. But But yeah, that's, I mean, the short story anyway. Further on, I'll get into how COVID's helped rather than hurt us in the small scale fishery. We have pretty much a very large fishing fleet in Rhode Island of vessels ranging from 20 feet to 160 feet. And pretty much there's an imbalance in who we sell our fish to. As a matter of fact, we just learned from one of the fish houses, they're refusing to take fish from any fisherman that's trucking their fish to the fish house. So that eliminates one fish house from us having access. And that happened overnight to us. So fortunately, things have changed and we're starting to be able to sell off of our boats, which I think for international fishermen, that's kind of funny to hear that I can't sell my fish to a consumer, but that's changing. That's about it. I'm almost awake.
Thanks, Jason.
It is 3:12 in the morning.
We're all gradually waking up in various ways. Thanks, Jason. Now we'll go to Nova Scotia. Courtney.
Good morning. I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this panel as well. So my work's been conducted in the Atlantic Canadian provinces and focused on socioeconomic impacts of small-scale fisheries and coastal communities, on comprehensive approaches to assessing sustainable fisheries management, and also in resolving conflict involving small-scale fisheries. Currently, I'm working under the supervision of Dr. Paul Foley, and my research uses access theory as theorized by Rebo and Peluso to examine access to fisheries resources and markets in Newfoundland and Labrador. So Rebo and Peluso define access as the ability to derive benefits from things, and access theory suggests that access depends on more than just property or tenure rights, and includes mechanisms like illegal access, access to technology, capital, markets, labor, knowledge, authority, social identity, and social relations. And as you know, Newfoundland is the site of the historic cod collapse, but it is also home to resilient coastal communities and fisheries who are adapting to monumental social ecological change. So today, Jason had mentioned that their market is predominantly, their fisheries predominantly marketed out, so export oriented. That's the same as Newfoundland fisheries. The largest market is actually going to the United States. And then this is followed by China, and then other markets are Denmark, the United Kingdom, Iceland, and Japan. A 2018 review of seafood industry in the province, which combines data from both wild fisheries and aquaculture, stated that the value of total fish and seafood production was $1.3 billion. And of that, 752 million in total landed value was from wild commercial fisheries. So shellfish, which includes snow crab, shrimp, and lobster, makes up the greatest percentage of that. That's followed by pelagics and then groundfish. In total, the fishing industry in Newfoundland employs almost about 16,000 people from over 400 communities, and most of those are very rural. Now, the SSF guidelines state that there are different definitions of small-scale fisheries. So in Newfoundland, we have three different fleet sizes. There's the inshore, which is comprised of vessels under 35 feet. There's the midshore, which is comprised of vessels between 35 and 65 feet, and then offshore, which is 65 feet and above. The inshore vessels are what we would consider small in scale, and the inshore fishery takes place in the spring, in the summertime, and in the fall. And similar to other parts of the world, the ability to secure access and increase benefits derived from small-scale fisheries and markets has been impacted from neoliberalism. And we've seen a lot of critical literature come out on that, particularly as it relates to individual transferable quotas. And this has been extremely valuable research. In Newfoundland, there are various other policies and regulations and laws that have emerged within this context of neoliberalism, which has received very little attention. So in some cases, these policies are characteristic of neoliberalism, and in other cases, they disrupt these processes of neoliberalism. Because there's been very little focus on these policies, there's little understanding of how this is shifting power relations, and therefore whether these policies are actually improving small-scale fisheries or whether they're destructive in nature. There's also been very little research that links access to benefits of small-scale fisheries with biological or ecological changes of the oceans, such as when there's a change in the abundance or distribution of a species due to either anthropogenic activity or variations in the natural environment. So this is particularly important to understand because climate change is going to impact distribution of access, and this is going to benefit some over others. So this is the type of stuff that my research is looking at, and this is the context in which I'm going to contribute to the panel discussion today.
Great, thank you so much, Courtney. And then down to South Africa with Martin.
Thank you, Aeneas, and good morning, everyone. And thank you also for inviting me to be part of this panel. Really looking forward to our discussions this morning. So I ended up in fisheries a bit by default. I'm a scientist by training, and I worked as a fisheries observer for 3 years. I was actually my career was initially focused on terrestrial ecology. I ended up working in fisheries as an observer. I did one trip as a commercial fisherman and decided that's not really the kind of job for me. It's the hardest I've ever worked in my life. And then I was also a fisheries manager at the South African government for a couple of years. And I've worked in as a fisheries consultant for many years, various projects. And I guess in small-scale fisheries, I really got involved in small-scale fisheries in South Africa and also East Africa when I started with the Marine Stewardship Council, set up their regional program in the African region. And then I joined the International Pole and Line Foundation 5 years ago. It's an international charity very much focused on small-scale tuna fisheries. We call those one-by-one tuna fisheries, pole and line, hand line, and troll fisheries. And we work at the fishery level, looking at improvements around the way the fisheries operate, also improvements in traceability, quality, to some extent focused on market access through our membership base, which incorporates a number of international retailers, buyers, processors, but also looking at food security issues and the contribution that these fisheries can make to local communities. So as an example, we work with one-man canoes in Indonesia catching yellowfin tuna, and then larger vessels operating in the Maldives and also of the west coast of the US that use troll lines and pole and line fishing methods. We also work at the policy level, representing the voice of these one-by-one fisheries at government level, and then also very importantly at the tuna RFMOs, which are the regional management organizations where all the decision making is happening. And so it's all about promoting these small-scale fisheries around fishing opportunities, access to fishing opportunities, but also market access. So that is in brief what I do. And as I said, I look forward to contributing to this discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Martin. Well, welcome everyone. I'm wondering whether we can start with you, Vatsu. Tell us a little bit about what is the current situation with the small-scale fisheries that you work with in terms of access to resources and in particular markets.
So, sorry, can you repeat, please? I was cut a little bit.
No problem. What's the current situation with the small-scale fisheries that you work with, in particular when it comes to access to resources and markets?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Niaz. Actually, one of the big issues that we have in Madagascar is the fact that there is no kind of standardized price for the resources, which means that the communities, there is no fixed price, which means that if we have kind of middlemen and collectors coming, they need to negotiate. There is big negotiation, which means that the price can go really low. And the fact is, most of the small-scale fishers in Madagascar do not have kind of cool storage, kind of fridge where they can store their product, which means that they need to sell it at any price that the middlemen or the collectors might take the product. And also here we, as I said at the beginning, there is a lack of mechanism for the allocation of resources, which means that it is not clear. And that is something that need to be done later. Like how can we really make sure how is the resources allocated to the different users? So that is one of the biggest issues that we have, and also some of those small-scale fishers are really dependent to those collectors in terms of the equipment that they use. So what we need to do is really try to create a kind of partnership, direct partnership between the small-scale fishers and maybe the big collectors. So there is no kind of people in the middle, because sometimes we can have like 1, 2, 3 middlemen between them, and it really makes the price really low. So that is one of the issues that we have.
Yeah, I think the issue of price is probably universal, is my guess, is that I hear that from fishermen and fishing communities all over the globe, really, is that they're not getting paid really their cost of operation, what they need to make a living. So it doesn't
And also there is the remote area, because most of the small-scale fishers in Madagascar are in isolated area, which means that they have to rely on those collectors. And there are some fishing villages here where some collectors, they only have one collector to collect all the product. Then it's really the collectors that have to decide about the price, and so that's also a big. I think it's everywhere, but for the case of Madagascar, the roads are really bad, so it creates really
additional challenges. Yeah, thanks, Batu. Jason, do you want to talk about that? What the issues of access to resources? I know firsthand what's happening in Rhode Island, but maybe you can give us your personal experience and knowledge.
Still, okay, there we are. What's sad is to hear what she just said, because it's the same thing here. Pretty much what has traditionally gone on is that we rely on a fish house, or I like the fact collector, because same name. I mean, it's the same thing. Where we're dealing with right now, we're trying to do a fisheries cooperative because of these issues. I mean, we have no access to cold storage. We have no access to ice. So we rely specifically on a fish house to provide us with ice and cold storage. I mean, that's how we sell our fish. We sell to them. They'll give us ice for the next trip. We come in from the next trip. Fortunately, we have one guy that will come pick up our fish. But normally, I'll have to take the fish off my boat, put it in my truck, and drive a 50-mile round trip after fishing all day to drop off my fish. And about the price, I mean, same thing. I catch a fish that we call it a scup around the world. It's called sea bream. The average price is 5 cents to $1. $1 being the highest you may get all year. If I sell that fish myself, I can sell that smallest fish, instead of 5 cents a pound, I get $1 a pound. And the bigger fish, I get $1.50 to $3 a pound. But because we have no infrastructure, we have no access to ice, no cold storage, it's really difficult. And also no access to capital. For a small scale fisherman to go to a bank and get a loan, they just look at you and laugh at you. They say, well, what do you have to back it up? Well, a broken boat and a beat up outboard. You walk back out the door. So, but it's sad to think of, the price fixing is common around the world from what I'm understanding now. And it's so wrong. The people that do the hardest work get the least amount for the work. And the middleman just handles the fish and ships it to someone else and makes 4 times what the fisherman makes. So yeah, it's sad to know that it's common around the world, but changes have come because we're able to sell fish now. It's just getting the infrastructure in place that we're working on now.
We'll get to that next. Courtney, you talked a little bit about the access to resource issues as you were telling your story. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting, this discussion that's taking place on the price setting. I mean, in Newfoundland, it's a slightly different circumstance because we have a price setting panel. So, and market prices and all of that type of thing are taken into consideration. And then harvesters propose, or the union proposes a price, and then the buyers and the processors propose a price. And then this price setting panel actually comes to a decision as to what the price is going to be. So it's a slightly different circumstance. And I mean, there's still disputes that occur, there's no question, but it's an interesting format, the approach that they're using. And I guess something, I'm just gonna switch gears a little bit here. I think one of the big circumstances that has changed recently in Canada with respect to access for small-scale fish harvesters has been the introduction of something called Bill C-68, which changed our Federal Fisheries Act, and it codified the owner-operator fleet separation policies, which were developed in the 1970s to promote the distribution of fishing access to small-scale fishers, and then also to restrict vertically integrated fishing companies from owning and consolidating inshore and midshore vessels. So it also includes new language that affirms the federal minister of fisheries has to consider social, cultural, and economic factors in decisions about the management of fisheries. And then it also has implications, this bill does, for Indigenous access. So Section 2 aligns with the Canadian government's current practice to reconcile existing and emerging policies and principles that give recognition and respect to Indigenous land claims and rights to natural resources. This is very, very new. It was only, it only received royal assent in June of 2019, so just last June. We have yet to see what this means for our fish harvesters, but I mean, it's pretty big.
Yeah.
That there's some safeguard for them now.
Yeah, we should take a look at some of what you talked about here in the US. We've been advocating as NAMA for owner-operator acceptance and the lack of the limit to consolidation by especially highly vertically integrated operations. So we'll have to follow up with you about lessons learned we can apply here. And of course, the rights of Indigenous people being acknowledged when it comes to natural resources. So thank you, Courtney. And Martin, what about you? What are some of the current situation in terms of access to resources and markets that you are working with?
Yes, thanks for the question. You know, many people don't see tuna fisheries as really fitting the small-scale fisheries bill always, but as I said before, many of the fisheries we work with are really small-scale artisanal type of fisheries. Around 10% of the global production comes from these smaller scale type of fisheries. And there's lots of opportunities for growth within you know, the small scale sector in tuna fisheries. But the dice is rolled against them in many aspects. I mean, many of the large tuna fisheries are industrial scale tuna fisheries. There's harmful fishery subsidies have contributed to increases in capacity, and especially in longline and purse seine fisheries on the high seas. There's often issues around human rights abuses on many of these vessels operating in the industrial sector. And therefore we try and shine the light on the positive aspects around the social benefits of the small-scale fisheries, the connectedness to communities, the local supply chains, the development of local economies through value addition. But often the discussions at the RFMOs where decisions are taken is very much against the small-scale fisheries. And in many cases, coastal states rent out their resources to larger industrial fisheries. So we really try and sort of help these countries understand the benefits of local development of those tuna resources. Firstly, looking at some of the artisanal fisheries, also just looking at the possibilities of quality improvement, accessing better markets with better quality product, addressing post-harvest losses, and then ultimately seeing whether we can help these fisheries access international markets. And that's really where it becomes difficult, because some of these Large industrial fisheries are increasingly also being recognized as sustainable, which we don't agree with, the criteria for sustainability. And unfortunately, that only considers environmental aspects, and often these environmental aspects are not fully understood and fully analyzed. And so there's very little recognition of the intrinsic social benefits that the one-by-one fisheries bring. So it's difficult and it's an uphill battle, but we have made a difference, and we've got committed partners in the markets that we work with, and we will continue to support these fisheries.
Thank you, Martin. And Gayatri, would you expand on that a little bit based on your experience? What are some of what's the current situation there?
I mean, I'll start from maybe what Jason and Vatsu mentioned in terms of the price dropping quite drastically within the last 3 years, and it's happening here as well. But what's interesting from our own experience here in Sri Lanka is that for us, it's been a series of crises. So you could talk about the war in the north and east of the country, where the fishermen were directly impacted, and there's, I mean, almost zero fishing could take place in the seas. Fishermen slowly started to recover from that when the war ended in 2009. And then we were slapped with a export ban to the EU in 2015, 2016, based on Sri Lankan government's failure to regulate IUU fishing. And then we managed to get our act together and put all the legislation, most of the legislation in place, and also started implementing the policies and the laws. And then the ban was lifted in 2016, so the fishing picked up again. And now we are in 2020, which is almost like a non-year to most people. So it's this, you know, it's multiple crises that the small-scale fishers and everybody face with, you know, in varying degrees within the country. And also, I think Jason mentioned cooperatives, and I think either an attempt or a practice of selling fish through the cooperatives. And what's interesting in Sri Lanka is that, especially in the northern province, there is a very strong there was historically a very strong cooperative movement, which still exists. So, for example, if I give a very specific example of these blue swimming crabs in Sri Lanka that's caught off the northern seas of Sri Lanka, there's been support to strengthen the existing cooperatives. So during the war and just after the war, the crab was sold at $2, $3 per kg. And then with the cooperatives strengthened, market chains established, both at the local, the national level, as well as global market trade. So here we are talking about certification, sustainable harvesting, including some labor standards as well, and managed to get the international certifications in place. And the fishers, these one-day fishers, artisanal fishers, were connected to the global value chain. And the price increased threefold for about 5 years, 6 years. And what's happening now? It has fallen back to the during war prices. So you would think that, you know, we got it all right, that we managed to pull it together, and then our export markets are mainly the EU, the US, and then Japan and China. So with the global value chains almost completely collapsing, the price dropped drastically. And then the internal marketing, within country marketing, also collapsed. So then, I mean, we joke here saying that it's only now that we as Sri Lankans eating quality fish, because the first grade fish that was exported, now that cannot be exported, so it's coming to the local market. And the export companies are also now, you know, they've got their game up on the online marketing, which some of the other actors cannot do. So the good stuff is now in the local markets. So, I how I find it interesting how dynamic these the context that we work with, the realities that we work with, and how they just change so quickly. And then, of course, the need for us also to respond and learn lessons from whatever that we can in order to push the sector, keep pushing the sector, basically.
Yeah. Thank you for laying all that out. You guys also had another crisis that you had to deal with, which was a tsunami in 2004, which affected quite a bit of infrastructure and access, I would imagine.
That's right. And in the, but yes, of course, the tsunami, it was 2004 December. So at least for 2-3 years, the infrastructure was, almost completely gone. The boats were gone. And the effects of tsunami also varied around the island, which is also interesting. But at the same time, if the small-scale fishers, the artisanal fishers, if they had their boats and their engines, they could go out to the sea. So they don't rely too much on infrastructure. They don't need the big harbors.
That's right.
They can use a small landing site to go out and bring their fish in if there's someone to buy their fish. So I think that helped to a large extent. But then with all the funding, the donor funding and the local funding that went into these coastal areas, I would say that the sector recovered quite well, and some people say too well.
Oh, I see.
Because then there were, 2-3 boats owned by one fisherman. So, it became a bit of a mess. And then, it slowly started easing out, and then you face something else. So it's this kind of trajectory that you can observe.
Yeah. It's funny, you mentioned 2020. Many people call it a non-year. Jason, do you want to talk a little bit about how this non-year in the context of COVID has affected, well, how does that play a role, if any, in the fisheries that you're experiencing? We'll start with you.
Well, let me see. I think the positive that came out of it, which for some people is hard to believe, but the state of Rhode Island issued an emergency action so that we could sell fish direct to consumers. What's interesting about it is they're already having problems with the reporting end of it, because many of the people that are in the fishery are, I'm the young guy and I'm 52. So I still know how to use a computer and a cell phone, where a lot of these guys are in their late 60s, early 70s, and they're asking to report dealer reports, fisherman reports, and then a combination of the two besides fishing. So once you're done with your fishing day and you sell your fish at the dock, then within that week, you have to report a dealer's report, a fisherman's report, and then the fisherman's report is interesting and confusing for some of the older guys because they're the dealer. So when they're filling out the report, they have to go into the safest reporting app and put themselves in as a dealer. Half of these guys just can't cope with that. And I think it shows the sadness of all of this, is that I think, especially in our country, is we have managed to complicate things as much as possible in order for somebody to get a fresh fish. And I mean, a friend of mine lives in the Azores, and he said he just laughs every time I talk about this stuff, because in the Azores, he just goes down the street and buys the fish off the boat, and end of discussion. The thing's still moving. But I think the positive end of this is we're starting, the state and this country is starting to realize that we need to keep our food local. For so long, we have exported everything, and then we import, tilapia, swai, farm-raised shrimp, and then we export everything. And it's interesting that we import from Newfoundland. So, we're importing ground fish from Newfoundland, but we're exporting ground fish from Gloucester and Point Judith in New Hampshire and Maine. So, you know, why are we exporting the same fish that we're catching? And, you know, I mean, importing the same fish we're catching, and it doesn't make sense. But I think this has been an eye-opener for a lot of people. And I think it's also been a wake-up call for the bigger boats. Our larger fishing fleet, our offshore and near-shore fishing fleet came to a screeching halt. The prices dropped 85% overnight to the point where the boats could not fish because you could not pay your bills. So the entire fishery was shut down overnight. And then our small scale clam fishery, which can fish all winter, they were shut down overnight. The fishery I'm in, we only fish 6 months out of the year, maybe 7 if we're lucky. Maybe with global warming that'll change, but we're limited to where we can fish and when we can fish. But I think that's the upside is we're being recognized as essential. You know, I mean, the big bones weren't fishing, and our entire country had to depend on whatever was kept in freezer storage throughout this country. If you look at the marketing end of it, all of the frozen products in this country, the sales doubled for frozen seafood. Well, and they call it seafood. It's, you know, farm raised freshwater fish. But so I think that the challenges are still there for, you know, marketing and getting rid of the complexities of being able to market and sell your catch and make a living. But some of the benefits of this have been it's being recognized that the small scale fisheries are extremely important to this country.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. It might be worth noting that some of the changes that happened, particularly in Rhode Island, and some other states here in the U.S., were resisted prior to COVID-19. And the barriers that were put before fishermen we all argued that they were unreasonable barriers. And the virus certainly showed that you could remove those barriers and we weren't going to kill anybody in the process of feeding people. Yeah. So let's keep going. Courtney, you want to go next?
I do, only because my comment is related directly to what Jason is saying. Well, first I have a question for Jason. Do you think that it's going to prompt any changes for policy or legislation to enable direct sales in the long run? In Newfoundland, that only recently changed. So in 2015, there were changes in legislation which now enable direct sales. Previous to that, they were not allowed. So this does obviously provide some room for innovation and security, but I mean, that's only insofar as there is a live fishery going on right now. Like our lobster fishery, snow crab, shrimp were all put on hold, similar to what happened with you. So the whole direct sales, I mean, there's nothing to sell if you're not allowed to fish. But I think, you know, had that not occurred, had there's still been some fishing, then there could have been some potential for opportunity there for direct sales to happen as a result of COVID. So it's just, yeah, it's an interesting, I guess, difference from what's going on there. But we were at one point in that circumstance where there were no direct sales.
It's amazing just to think that it took something like this to wake people up to realize that a lot of the policies and regulations are absolutely unnecessary. Mm-hmm. In Rhode Island, I mean, we have the Department of Health controlling our ability to sell direct sales. Mm-hmm. So literally you take, and I forget the gentleman's name from Providence, an West African man who laughed when I said how the fishery works. And he said, so you take fresh fish and you make it old. And that's healthier. You know, I mean, that's what blows my mind. The fish that I catch are still moving when they come off the boat, but I can't sell them. Prior to this, I couldn't sell them directly to a consumer. Mm-hmm. But I can sell it to a fish house. It can get on a truck. It can be iced, repackaged at the fish house, shipped somewhere else, repackaged again, processed again, and then sold. So by the time someone eats it, it's 5 days old or older.
Yeah.
But that's considered healthier. So I mean, I think hopefully we're going to realize the policies and regulations are so antiquated that it has to change.
Yeah, the person you're talking about is Julius Kolawole. He is with
Yes.
the African Alliance of Rhode Island. They represent African immigrants in Rhode Island, and a big part of what they've been trying to do is to get access to local seafood, especially so some of the women can have some of the businesses that they've had before they immigrated, when they can actually do value-added work to the fish and sell the fish directly to consumers. Thanks, Jason and Courtney. Martin, do you want to talk about what's worse or better because of COVID? And before
Thanks,
you just say, Ratana has been sending me the questions from the viewers. We do have your questions. We will get to them once we go through another couple of rounds from our speakers. Sorry, Martin, go ahead.
Okay, yes, very interesting to hear the perspectives from Jason and Courtney. Obviously, in the tuna sector, the impacts have been various. I think with all these COVID-19 impacts, the small-scale fishes are probably the ones that suffer the most. Industrial tuna fisheries have managed to continue fishing in most cases, and in some of those vessels, they've never even been back to port since COVID-19 broke. You know, some of those high seas vessels continue to operate out in the high seas for sometimes 2-3 years at a time without coming back to port, doing all their transshipments at sea. Obviously, the impacts for small-scale fishermen are a lot worse. They've felt it, especially in the handline sector, where they rely on yellowfin exports, and I'm talking more about sort of international markets now. So yellowfin exports from places like the Maldives, Indonesia, to markets in Europe and the US have been completely disrupted through, firstly, the demand completely disappearing on the retail side, and the food service sector with restaurants closures, and then also logistics disruptions, because there were cancellation of flights, and they rely very much on flights to get their product out to these markets. On the can sector, however, and we also work with some of the pole and line fisheries that are very connected to canneries, the demand has increased substantially. In the US, for instance, they reckon the demand has gone up 400 to 800% in the tuna can sector. And you know, consumers are obviously very focused on these type of commodities where they can store things for long periods. And we'll have to see what happens when there's a normalization. There's sort of thinking that there's storage of these products, but when we get back to a situation of relative normalcy, we'll, you know, consumers won't necessarily sort of buy at the same levels as before, and they'll keep some of the canned tuna in storage for much longer periods, and we might get back to similar sort of levels of consumption. There's obviously also huge concerns around the lack of enforcement that's been brought about by COVID-19 in some of the tuna fisheries. You know, there's not observers being deployed in many of these fisheries. There's not the same level of at-sea inspections happening. Port inspections have fallen away in many places. And there's also thinking that we'll see an increase of IUU activities during this period. So there's a range of impacts, and we're not quite sure yet, you know, what the outcomes will be. But certainly the small-scale fishermen that we deal with are sort of have been dealt the shorthand, and they're struggling.
Thanks, Martin. Gayatri, what's happening in Sri Lanka in the context of COVID, the non-year?
Right. So I think in this round, what I would also like to highlight is we do hear at least some stories. So we do hear the export story, we do hear the price drop story about IUU, incidents going up. But I wonder, what about the completely silenced stories or narratives or lead realities? So, for example, I mentioned the women gleaners that I worked with 3-4 years back, and they had to begin with, they're not even recognized as fishers in the Sri Lankan policy, or within the fishing communities, or, as I said, even at the household levels, right? So they're not fishers. They're not counted in data. They're not registered anywhere, and they don't. So usually, the fishers in Sri Lanka, they carry an identity card provided by the Department of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources. These women do not have it, and they're completely under the radar. They're completely invisible. But also at the same time, they support their families. They generate savings. They pay back loans that sometimes their male relatives take for different purposes, and they save for generations, and they invest in things like gold jewelry and all of that. Right? These women. What is happening to them? Even I don't know actually what their status is right now, but what I could imagine is that they're completely at home, because we were under a complete lockdown till about a few weeks back. So they cannot catch, they cannot sell. What would happen, especially the women who support their families as the income earner? So I think for me, and this is why I think also the fact that we need to think of small scale fishers as a diverse group also becomes important, because we need to be listening to these, openly listening to, or proactively listening to these silenced stories as well, I feel.
That's a good point. Batsu, how about in Madagascar and with the Maori network? What's happening there because of COVID, good or bad?
Thank you, Nias. So for the case of Madagascar, maybe I would like to start first with the fact that actually, even if there was no COVID, I think that COVID is maybe nothing compared to over like cyclones or bad weather, because even if there was no COVID, those communities are not able also to fish. So that is maybe something important to mention. We have more things that COVID who can affect those access to market or access to resources, or affect the socio-economic life of those small-scale fishers. So for the case of Madagascar, we got some calls from lots of our members about the fact that most of the middlemen and the collectors have left because of the COVID, because of the lockdown. So they had to reduce the price. So most of the catch were like half the normal price. So that is what is happening. And also most of them are dependent on the equipment from the collectors or the middlemen, like cold storage and stuff like that. So some of them really cannot continue fishing if they don't have the proper equipment. So that is what is happening. And another thing is also, since small-scale fishers here are in a remote area and isolated, most of them are not aware of this COVID-19. Like we need to do more radio programs. We have also some people that are not able to. We cannot call them because there is no network. So sometimes it's. Actually, we did a study with the Mihai network. We did a survey with 70 small-scale fishers around Madagascar to ask what is happening, and that is what we got. Like lots of people are not aware of, not aware, but like how to prevent it, and also they do not have the access to, let's say, the water, the gel and stuff like that. So that is something really unfortunate. Maybe something I want to share for Mihari. Actually, we are now working closely with our Ministry of Fisheries on the creation of a steering committee for COVID-19 and small-scale fishers, on how to help them to be resilient. So that steering committee is composed of about 15 people from the health sector, from Ministry of Population, from donors, from NGOs, from communities, and lots of stakeholders. And the objective is actually to elaborate a kind of roadmap or a kind of action plan on how can we support those small-scale fishers to be resilient to COVID-19. And we have recently organized a webinar like this with all the stakeholders to discuss on what is everyone doing in Madagascar and how can we provide those support and coordinate together for those small-scale fishers. But for sure, the COVID-19 has impact in the livelihoods of those fishers and their daily life. And now some of them are starting actually to exchange fish with rice or with soap or something like that. So that is what is happening. But as I said at the beginning, I think we also need to see the big picture because COVID is there, but when in Madagascar, when the road is, when we have issues with road, or when we have cyclone or bad weather, then the same thing that is happening now is actually happening. Yeah.
Mm. So just another layer of crisis on top of what people face on a day-to-day basis, essentially is what you're saying. There's a couple of questions related to this, or one question related to the COVID issue is that there are some innovative responses. There have been some innovative responses that have emerged. I know that that's the case here in the US. We talked a little bit about it in terms of Rhode Island. Also there is a network here that has some international partners called the Local Catch Network. And there's been a series of webinars where we've talked about some of those innovative responses. Curious from those of you who are experiencing or know of some of this, we've touched on them a little bit here today already. How do you think, what is needed to keep some of those innovations to continue? Why don't we start with you, Courtney?
I have to admit, I still have to go back to my key informants because I spoke to them before COVID hit. And so I haven't even had a chance to talk to them about any opportunities that they're using with respect to that change in the 2015 legislation for direct sales. I mean, I know that there were some things that they had been talking about prior to COVID, like they were looking to establish direct flights from Newfoundland to China for lobster so that it didn't have to go through Halifax, Nova Scotia. But I mean, I don't know how that's progressed any. And I do know one minister that I was speaking to was taking advantage of the direct sales prior to COVID and was able to ship stuff within the province and then ship stuff out of the province and then as a buyer and then in his off season. But again, I'm looking forward to getting back to these people to discuss how COVID's really impacted them because I haven't had an opportunity to do that yet.
Okay, well, thank you. Maybe you can update us at some point.
Yeah, I think
so. Yeah. Martin, I know that there were some challenges that you mentioned, but what about the opportunities? For those opportunities, how can we keep them post what you called returning to normalcy, although I'm not sure what we had before we should call normal, but post this phase of our life?
Yes, so post this phase of our life, I think, look, we are seeing some of the smaller companies we're working with coming up with good innovation. There's a company here in Cape Town called Greenfish. That's one of our members, for instance, and they've also connected directly to consumers. In fact, they deliver to my house now as well. And this is fresh fish off the boat is the type of examples that Jason was talking about. In South Africa, we don't have the sort of added layer of complexity around legislation. And that's been relatively easy for them to make that transition. And certainly, I think we'll see more of those type of innovative ideas coming into fruition. In the local market here in South Africa, we've generally exported all our best products, and often what we get on the market is not the best quality, or it's something that comes in from the outside that's produced through aquaculture and not necessarily at a cheaper price point. So I think there'll be a re-examination of these things connecting to local supply chains, and I think certainly there can be high-value local supply chains as well, direct connection to consumers. We've got a very interesting and a platform you might be familiar with in South Africa called Abelobi, which connects small-scale fishermen directly to chefs in restaurants, and it's really been a great innovation where the small-scale fishermen previously landed their catch in harbors, and they were basically exposed to whoever was there to collect the catch to whatever the price of the day was, and not a high level of negotiation was possible around the selling price. And this app has now connected them to a whole set of willing buyers that are negotiating price before they even land the catch, and then an arrangement is made to take the catch to wherever that buyer is, and that's really helped them increase the value of their catch. And I think we'll probably see more of these sort of innovative ideas coming to the fore.
Mm. Yeah, here in the US, the program that was launched, Dock to Dish, which was to connect fishermen directly with restaurants. Unfortunately, COVID affected all the restaurant openings, and so that's affected that direct relationship a little bit as well. But it's good to hear about this app that's actually providing another opportunity for the fishermen in South Africa. Gayatri, what about you? I know that you mentioned the invisible even becoming more invisible because of COVID-19. Are there things that are positive, some innovations of any sort that you're hearing about that can have an opportunity to continue into our next phase of life? Wait, hang on. There we go.
Sorry. So one of the innovations that we've heard about is some of us experience is also the export companies selling locally through online, marketing, because we were all under lockdown for about 2 months, and that became, at least to certain parts of the country, especially the more urban areas, good. I think it was a bit of a win-win. Given the circumstances to the consumer and the seller, but then again, I think the point there is that it's only people who already had the infrastructure, the kind of reach, the kind of skills, the kind of thinking before COVID hit that could then capitalize on it and at least make some kind of recovery. But the people who already did not, for example, have access to the digital marketing platforms, they were completely left behind, and they are still, left behind. Again, I think similar to what the point Jason made, the fishing community, the active fishers in Sri Lanka also getting older. So they are not the young, technologically savvy kind of fisher population that we have here. So some of them would not even own like a smartphone. So it's it's that kind of reality that we are talking about. So then, if we are to talk about transformative changes beyond quote unquote new normal or towards a new normalcies, I think I think there needs to be there's still a gap there's still a gap that has to be filled. Otherwise, I don't think these changes can continue. The other point I want to make is, and this is not happening right now, but I see this as a great opportunity for countries, especially like Sri Lanka, where our social protection schemes are it's not a universal blanket kind of social protection scheme that we have in place. So what's happening is that the fishermen, the fishers, they're seen as own account workers. So the labor laws, the social protection systems that apply to them are different compared to the rest of the workforce. So in that, and also at the same time from the fisher side, although there's been a push from the government side to get them into gratuity schemes and social protection schemes, there's been a bit of a pushback from the fishers. We don't need this right now. It doesn't really pay off. So why should we get on it? But I'm also hoping, and this is a conversation that we've also now starting to have with the fishers themselves, because this is really one of those rupture points where you feel that if you had some kind of money put aside in a structured formal way that you could draw on, really this would be what it would look like, what would become useful. So I think this is not happening right now, but I think this also can be this opportunity can be maximized to start a dialogue and build it towards some kind of transformation, not only at the policy level, but also at the community level also, I feel.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Catherine. You and Jason mentioned the technology issue and the challenge on the fishermen's side. I think it's worth noting that from a food justice, food access perspective in communities, we're having an issue with the eating side of things, where those who need the food most also have challenges with access to technology or currency even. They may not have the ability, a bank card, to be able to pay online. So it sort of has created this gap on both sides, I think, on the fishing side and the eating side, where we're not necessarily closing the food access gap in this process. And those of us with a lot of option and a lot of means have a little bit more convenient access, but we haven't really solved the food justice problem with technology yet. Hopefully we'll get there at some point. Vatsu, what about you? Are there innovations that you think can continue post COVID, and how would that look like? What would that look like?
Yeah. So what is happening here for now is most of the small-scale fishers are doing smoked fish or salted fish, so they can keep them for a longer time until the COVID is maybe over. So that is what they are doing. But the problem is that we do not have much collectors that might buy them. So that's the issue. But most of the fishing villages that we've asked, most of them are just doing smoked fish and salted fish. And what we are planning to do is probably to discuss with the steering committee to kind of capitalize or collect all the contact of collectors that are still working, because we know that some of them are still continue working, and try to create partnership between those small-scale fishers that are still doing their activities and those collectors. You've mentioned also about restaurants and hotels, but like here with the lockdown, all of them are closed. So that is also something that we need to figure out. Maybe something that I wanted to mention is for the Ministry of Fisheries in Madagascar, they have created the project, in English it's called kind of shopping where we can sell fishing gears and stuff like that, equipment for fishing for small-scale fishers at a very low price. So that is now the project ongoing here in few fishing villages. And also they are trying they've asked us to send them the list of what we think are vulnerable small-scale fishers. And then there is a plan to support those small-scale fishers that are vulnerable. So that is what we've done so far. But actually, as I said, we are working on a roadmap that will be produced by multi-stakeholders on different topics. So that is the next plan, not to have that roadmap on how we can support those communities, and also how can we continue those innovative and those opportunities in terms of post-COVID. Yeah.
Thank you. Jason, you mentioned a lot of that's happened in Rhode Island. And when you talked about COVID impact, do you feel like you have some hope that it will continue post the crisis?
Yes. I actually have a friend who works in enforcement, and he said the biggest challenge or the biggest obstacle is going to be the reporting in order to keep this thing going, because it affects quota, again, where regulation complicates things. But I think that aside, there is a demand for this. I think what's real interesting is before COVID, there was so much misinformation about seafood and about where to get it, how to access it, where does it come from, how old is it? And then all of a sudden, COVID happens, restaurants close, and people still would like to have seafood. And now they're realizing where it comes from. And they're like, oh, wait a minute, what do you mean I can't get fresh codfish or fresh flounder? So I think now the misinformation is kind of blown up to the point where people are now realizing that you can get fresh seafood locally. You don't have to eat farm-raised fish. And I think that this is going to expand because the state of Connecticut, you're able to sell fish directly off a vessel prior to COVID. You had to buy the permit, but it was about, I think, $60 to $100 a year. In Rhode Island, you had to get a dealer's permit. You have to have a facility. You have to have cold storage. You have to have a HACCP plan. You have to be approved by the Department of Health in order to sell fish. And that's not even processed fish. That's just whole fish. So I think, again, I think this is showing the antiquated regulatory process needs to get thrown out and we need to rework it. And I think that's what's going to happen because of this. Whether or not we continue with the direct sales program the way it is or not, I think it's the beginning, a pilot program, so to speak. And I think they're going to have no choice but to continue with direct sales because people are going to demand it.
I hope so.
Including fishermen.
Yeah.
Not just consumers.
Well, that's a really good point. When, for those who may not know, our organization piloted the concept of community-supported fisheries almost 12 years ago that have now grown. And one of the biggest points of resistance we experienced at the beginning was from fishermen, because it was a different way of doing things. And yep. I think we heard a lot from fishermen saying, nobody's going to want to do fill the blank. Nobody's going to want to buy whole fish. Nobody's going to want to buy this fish. Nobody's going to want to pay me a fair price. So we've seen that shift. So hopefully we'll continue to see innovations shifting the landscape. I'm going to switch a little bit. One of the questions is about what needs to change to secure access. Courtney, you mentioned a number of things in your introduction around regulations that have to do with neoliberalism at their roots. And Jason, you mentioned quotas as well. Are there regulations, rules, institutions that need to change in order to secure access, not only during this time of crisis, but as we move into, we keep calling it the next phase of our lives together, because I think I'm beginning to really resist the concept of normalcy in this dynamic world. So what needs to change in order to secure access for small scale fisheries? Courtney, why don't we start with you?
Well, I think my comment is going to touch on what each of the panelists has been talking about, which is there needs to be a fuller understanding of what access means. So does that mean access to technology? Does that mean access to or social identity, social relations? I mean, these things are happening in Madagascar. These things are relevant in Sri Lanka. So how that looks in terms of policy or legislation is a bit difficult. Like in Canada, does that mean including these multiple mechanisms of access into an integrated fisheries management plan? Or I'm not quite sure. That's something that I still have to think about, but it's quite obvious from what people are saying that these access mechanisms are very relevant and need to be incorporated in decisions about allocation, and particularly where it involves small-scale fish harvesters.
Martin?
Yes, allocation is a very topical issue in tuna fisheries as well. It's discussions we are very involved in the Indian Ocean. For instance, at the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission, they've been struggling now. I think it is must be more than 10 years, probably running on to 12 years, to come to to agree to a model of allocation. And it's an issue that's very important for the coastal states. As I said before, often tuna resources in places like Madagascar, Sri Lanka, and other coastal states, the tuna resources are often accessed by distant water fishing nations that pay a fee for that access, and often that fee is not very related to true market pricing. And the coastal states lose out. And the discussions at the moment at the IOTC, for instance, revolves around historic ownership of catches. So some of the distant water fishing nations are arguing when they caught tuna in the Madagascan economic zone 10 years ago, that allocation actually belongs to them, which is totally contrary to international legal framework and just common sense. So we are arguing for a much tougher position when it comes to allocation, that there's proper recognition of the rights of the coastal states in those discussions, and ultimately to ensure sustainable management of these resources, we need to come to a place where the tuna resources can actually be cut up into pies, to a pie, and the various countries can be given a certain allocation to manage. We're far from that yet, and that is a continual issue when we look at overfishing of stocks. We're talking about highly migratory stocks that don't respect national jurisdictions, but move vast areas across the ocean. And ultimately, we want to get to a place of proper management and effective management of these stocks. We need to get to a point where equitable, fair allocation systems are in place, but we're still far from that. In terms of the market access, we also hitting a wall in terms of some of the procurement policies that are put in place, and again focusing on the sort of international market access. There's been a big drive towards certification, eco-labeling standards, what's called fisheries improvement projects, and it's very difficult for small-scale fisheries to access markets via these programs. There's a cost issue involved. In many cases, it's unaffordable for small-scale fisheries, and in many cases, they are sidelined from those markets because they don't have it. And that's looking at potential technical barriers to trade type of issues, where private standards dictate to the markets who should have access and who shouldn't. And obviously, there's huge issues there that need to be unpacked. And I guess the responsibility really comes in that responsible ethical buyers need to consider sort of their procurement policies, align it with the 2030 agenda and the sustainable development goals, and understand that you cannot just make these decisions based on a private standard that is only focused on environmental sustainability, but you need to consider impacts on livelihoods, on communities, and whole social systems. So that's what we are pushing for and will continue to push for. But I think there needs to be a proper rethink on the way we do business and the way retailers and the food service sectors do business, and often also the way they are informed by their NGO partners around the concepts of sustainability.
I want to get to Gayatri and Vatsu on this topic, but I just want to note that here in the US, one of the things that we've been really doing that might be helpful for others, I don't know to what extent it's applicable to other countries. We've been working with NGOs that advise healthcare institutions and higher education institutions around their procurement policies and around their seafood policies in particular. Many of these institutions had taken a position and rethought their buying practices when it came to land food, when it came to what they got from farmers and ranchers. And we took advantage of the fact that they had already established those and introduced seafood to that same conversation, encouraging them to look at their sustainability around seafood through the same lens. And we began to see an increase in procurement policies from healthcare and educational institutions that were focused on community-based small-scale fisheries and essentially relocalizing and re-regionalizing their procurement policies when it came to seafood. We're happy to share some of what we've learned there. Healthcare Without Harm is the international partner that works around the world with healthcare institutions, and there are also others that we can share with folks if you think that kind of procurement policy shift will be helpful. I know we have about 10 minutes left at this point, but I do want to hear from you, Gayatri. What are some of the changes that need to happen, regulations, rules, institutional, that will support small-scale fisheries? And then Vatsu, will go to you after that, and then we'll wrap it up. I have a closing questions for all of you that we'll get to after that.
So I'll be quick. I think I'll pick up from where Martin left off in terms of the certification processes and the market access, with the and the point that what's being considered right now are mostly environmental aspects, but the need for stress on the socioeconomic, cultural context, the realities that most of these small-scale fisheries operate in. It's I think also the frame of analysis and the frame for policy decisions at national and international levels also should take the scalar effect, or should be based on the fact that these differentiated access, so the different sorts of access that people have, whether it's to the natural resource itself, to the spaces where the fishing happens, or to the markets, they play out at different levels. So if you take the international level and the international waters for countries like Sri Lanka or Cambodia, there's this constant ongoing discussion, tension with the neighbors. For Sri Lanka, it's India, and for Cambodia, it's the Vietnamese. And this whole process of the other, that's always, the bigger, the bad guy, stealing our resources. But at the same time, we are neighbors. So we do share a similar socioeconomic background as well, and relationships as well, that of course keep changing historically. So it's this, that is at the international level, how I see these social relations playing out. But you could take it within the country, national. You take Sri Lanka. It's a multiple ethnicity. There are different ethnicities, religious groups, caste, class, different groupings of the coastal communities in Sri Lanka. So then there are issues of access that again have quite historical tensions woven into these relationships within the country as well. So there are the local migratory fishers that come and fish in our fishing lots. They do not have this, right? And then you do these tension points. And then you could even observe it, I guess, at the community, the very, landing site level, or maybe at the household level as well, these tensions, access issues playing out. For example, if it's a man who owns the boat, would the wife, the woman in the family be able to access that? Or if it's in the name of the wife and a male relative operates that boat, what kind of rights would the woman owner have? Both in terms of paper, but also in how law is being applied and practiced. So I think, it's at these different levels that we need to be thinking of differentiated access. And it's all of these that will have to come into place in order for us to get to a meaningful change.
Yeah. Thank you. Watsu.
Yeah, I'll be quick also. I would say, I'll talk about what we do here, but I would say putting in place maybe a kind of blue economy strategy per country, and where we can integrate access to market and access to resources for small-scale fisheries. Second one can be putting in place a kind of fisheries transparency initiative per country. We have that actually in Madagascar with Transparency International. And that could help in the transparency of license or agreement and stuff like that. And everyone can be aware of how is the resources allocated. And the last one, I would talk about blue justice at the national level, because we talk about lots of advocacy work for small-scale fishers. Can we put a kind of regulation linked with blue justice, and where we can integrate the rights of small-scale fishers toward access to market and access to resources.
Jason, is there a particular change, administrative policy level, that you think needs to happen?
Definitely. I think part of the issue we have in the States is that we have a large recreational fishing lobby, but the recreational fishing allocation and the commercial fishing allocation are actually looped together. So if a recreational fishery goes over their quota, that is, the overage is taken out of the entire allocation, so that, say the recreational fishery goes over 30%, that 30% is taken away from commercial and recreational. Yet commercial harvesters have to document everything, pretty much real-time reporting, where recreational fishermen have no accountability. So they don't have to technically report anything. So this is interesting, because for the first time, I think ever, the for-hire fishery, the charter fisheries, are siding with the commercial fisheries regarding allocation, because charter fisheries and commercial fisheries have to report on a weekly basis what they catch. Yet we're going to lose allocation to the recreational sector because they are $1 billion lobby. So that just came up in the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, and they didn't realize how much pushback they were going to get from the for-hire sector and commercial sector, because they were utilizing data pulled out of the air by recreational fishermen to give them more quota. So I think that's a change that is coming, where there needs to be more accountability across the board to spread this allocation evenly. I mean, if a commercial fishery goes over, we're penalized. As a matter of fact, when we get close to reaching our quota, the fishery closes. Striped bass is the best example of that. Recreational fishermen can fish for striped bass for 365 days a year because they go up, and anadromous, they go up in the fresh water. I think we landed 30 days of commercial striped bass last year, and then our allocation was shut off.
Mm.
So I think there's definitely going to be some regulatory changes. People are starting to realize that commercial fishermen aren't the ones that are decimating the entire fisheries population. Just ask the boys in British Columbia. I got to give you the shirt. Ask the kids in British Columbia about their salmon fishery and the fact that the recreational sector is taking over and lobbying to push the commercial salmon fishery out of business.
Yeah.
And I didn't know that till I went there, and it was actually overwhelming to hear it. So I think strength in numbers. I'm laughing that I'm speaking with people around the world right now, because if we band together, there's going to be serious pushback from us.
Yes, indeed. Well, we have only a couple of more minutes left, 5 minutes maybe at the most. And so my closing question to all of you, and we'll go in this order if you want to give some thought. We'll go to Courtney, and then Martin, and then Jason, and then Vatsu, and we'll close with you, Gayatri. Is what's the best thing that can happen for small scale fisheries in your opinion? One, the best thing that can happen in your mind, and is there a vehicle for making that happen that you know of already? Or if you could dream what that would be, if you don't know it, maybe you can tell us what you think that vehicle should be. Courtney?
Yeah, I mean, so I think through continued support and prioritization in policies and legislation, but I also think it's important to reflect on policies that have already been established and those that are being established, to examine their interactions, to look at their cumulative impacts and determine whether they are actually enabling or hindering. We just can't keep piling more and more and more regulations and policies on small-scale fish harvesters without understanding what it means for them. And we can reflect on policies and regulations in a formalized way and actually operationalize something like SDG 14B through the use of sustainability frameworks, such as that developed by the Canadian Fisheries Research Network. It allows you to assess socio-economic objectives around distribution of access and benefits and regional economic benefits to the communities. And interestingly, the SSF guidelines in Section 13 state that states should recognize the importance of monitoring systems that allow institutions to assess progress towards implementation of objectives and recommendations of the SSF guidelines. So I think there are mechanisms in place to enable that.
Great, thank you. Martin?
Yes, two things from my side. In terms of local ownership, it would be great if some of the coastal states could take more responsibility and more ownership of their tuna fisheries and help develop those as small-scale sustainable fisheries instead of just renting out the resource. In the long term, there's obviously a lot of benefits other than just monetary benefits. So that would be great if that could happen. We are working with coastal states in the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean to build capacity with government so that they understand the benefits better, and also assisting some of the coastal states in helping develop these fisheries. But obviously, it needs a lot more than just our small organization to make that really happen. Secondly, it would be really great to, when we look at international tuna markets, to get consumers more engaged on the issues around so-called sustainability. To give you an example, tuna caught by almost modern-day slaves gets a sustainability accreditation and ends up in a responsible retailer and pushes out tuna from a responsible small-scale fishery due to a differential in price, because that larger industrial scale fishery also benefited through harmful fishery subsidies. So there's no question about what is a sustainable option, but consumers don't understand that. And I think groups like Too Big to Ignore and other groups that are very engaged on small-scale fisheries issues can help to ensure that the right procurement policies are put in place at the retail sector and the food service sector, so that we can really get true sustainability recognized in these fisheries.
Thank you, Art. Jason?
Well, I think one of the things that I'm envious of is that Newfoundland and the east coast of Canada are all owner-operator. I think a big step in this country is we need to push the corporate ownership of quotas and permits completely out of the picture. I think every vessel that operates in this country should be an owner-operator. It's a game changer. But on the other end of it, I am really, really happy that there's recognition after years of fighting this, even before NAMA, for me, just fighting for the little guy, to get some recognition that we are important in this business, that we have less impact ecologically, and that we provide a better quality product. I think it's finally getting out there that people are realizing that, you know, through the trace and trust movement with farming here, and then it got into the fishing end of it. So I have some positive, you know, hopes that we're going to move forward and progress in this. But I think it's going to take some serious regulatory changes in order to, you know, put the ball back in the court of the little guy, instead of all of these large corporations owning our fishery, which in turn, because they own our fishery, it makes the price, you know, so low that you can't make a living wage. But to have, you know, worldwide recognition that small fishermen are essential, you know, here comes another catchphrase from COVID. We are now essential workers, because guess what? People need to eat.
Wow. Thanks, Jason. Batsu?
Yeah, so I would say I think most of small-scale fishers do not really have access to information. I think it's similar in lots of countries. They are involved in the value chain, but they do not have information about what kind of product are people looking for, who are the collectors and stuff like that. So I would say we need to make sure that they have the right access to information. They have all information in hand. I would propose also to create a partnership or linking up a small-scale fisheries cooperative with a direct collector, so they can do a direct negotiation about the price, and of course trying to standardize the price of the product. And then I'll strengthen what I said about alternative livelihoods, because that is one of the most important things, that where we should support the small-scale fishers, like doing smoking fish or stuff like that. And finally, I'm not sure if in other countries we have those refund, like collectors have to pay refund with regional authorities, but maybe we can try to decrease that refund that the collector need to pay, which means that the small-scale fishers do not have also to contribute into it when they sell their product. And finally, the small-scale fisheries guideline, I think there is a need to try to really implement it per country. For the case of Madagascar, I know that there was some project from the FAO to do a simpler kind of version of it, where the small-scale fishers can understand through images, and so that I think that would be interesting also to really communicate and implement that SSF guideline at the local level with the small-scale fishers.
Thank you so much. And Gayatri, you get the final word.
Yeah, but I only have 3 words then. I think for me, it should be all about recognition, respect for diversity, and power to the small scale fishers. I think if we can strategize, plan, and approach our whatever we do in terms of small scale fishes, whatever kind of work we do within those three almost principles, moral principles, I think that is really what I wish for small scale fishes globally.
Thank you so much to all of our presenters, Courtney and Martin, Jason and Vatsu and Gayatri. I really appreciated your stories and your lessons and your vision for what's possible. And I hope that we can all bring the small and mid-scale part of the fishing industry together globally towards some of the changes that you've all outlined. Thank you to all the viewers and to Too Big to Ignore for joining us.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of the day.
Wonderful to meet everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.